The mission briefing was a ghost story told under the hum of fluorescent lights. It was a tale of a place that shouldn't exist, nestled deep in a valley so treacherous it was nicknamed the Serpent's Tooth. High-value target, the kind that could shift the balance of power in the region, was holed up in a fortified compound. The problem wasn't getting in. SEAL Team 6 was the sharpest knife in the drawer. The problem was the sky. The valley was a natural fortress, a tight, winding canyon with sheer rock walls that clawed at the heavens. It was a death trap for anything with wings. Surface-to-air missile sites, strategically placed and brutally effective, created a dome of denial over the entire area. No drone could survive the flight in, and no conventional air support could get low enough to be effective without becoming a fiery spectacle against the canyon walls. The SEALs had a plan, of course. A quiet, brutal insertion under the cover of a moonless night. But exfiltration was another story. If things went sideways, they were on their own. No cavalry, no air support, no last-minute rescue. It was a one-way ticket if the hornet's nest was kicked. The mission planners had run every simulation. Every single one ended with the same grim conclusion. The risk to any air asset was unacceptable. The valley was a no-fly zone, not by decree, but by the brutal reality of its geography and the enemy's layered defenses. It was a suicide run for any pilot foolish enough to try. The SEALs, stone-faced and stoic, accepted the terms. They were used to being the first in and last out, to operating on the razor's edge of the impossible, but this was different. This felt less like a mission and more like a sacrifice. The silence in the briefing room was heavy, thick with unspoken fears and the grim acceptance of their fate. Then, a new name appeared on the asset roster, a single A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Valkyrie. A ripple of disbelief, then quiet, cynical laughter spread through the room. An A-10, a warthog, the slow, lumbering beast of a plane, designed for a different kind of war, was being sent into the most sophisticated anti-air environment on the planet. It was a joke, a sick, bureaucratic joke. The pilot's name was Major Kalen Valkyrie, and the SEALs, the most elite fighting force in the world, were about to learn that some ghosts are real, and some legends are forged in the crucible of impossible odds. They thought they knew the limits of courage and skill. They were wrong. The sky was about to get very, very small, and the woman flying that warthog was about to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. The legend of Valkyrie was about to begin. The SEAL's skepticism was a tangible thing. A wall of quiet derision that Major Rostova felt the moment she walked into the forward operating base's cantina. They were a tribe, a brotherhood forged in the fires of selection and combat. And she was an outsider, a pilot, and a woman at that, assigned to a mission they had already written off as a one-way trip. They sat in a tight-knit group, their conversation a low rumbling murmur that ceased the moment she entered. Their eyes, hard and unforgiving, tracked her as she crossed the room. She was of average height, with a lean, athletic build that spoke of years of disciplined training. Her flight suit was worn, faded in the way that only countless hours in a cockpit can achieve. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight regulation bun, and her face, though youthful, was etched with a quiet intensity. There was a stillness about her, a self-contained confidence that seemed to unnerve the hardened operators. She didn't try to ingratiate herself, didn't offer a forced smile or a nervous greeting. She simply met their gazes. Her own eyes, a startling shade of pale blue, as clear and cold as a winter sky. One of them, a broad-shouldered giant with a thick beard and a chest full of commendations, finally spoke, his voice laced with a casual, dismissive arrogance. "You, the pilot?" he asked, not bothering to stand. "Major Rostova," she replied, her voice calm and even. "But you can call me Valkyrie." The name hung in the air for a moment, a challenge and a promise. The SEALs exchanged glances, a mixture of amusement and contempt. Valkyrie, a mythical warrior woman who carried the souls of the dead to Valhalla. It was a dramatic, almost theatrical call sign, and to these men, who dealt in the brutal, unvarnished reality of life and death, it seemed absurd. "Valkyrie," the SEAL repeated, a smirk playing on his lips. "You plan on carrying us out of that valley on your wings, Major?" The question was a jab, a test of her mettle. They expected her to be intimidated, to falter under their collective scrutiny. They were used to pilots who were either cocky hotshots or nervous rookies. Rostova was neither. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying an unnerving weight of authority. "I plan on making sure you walk out on your own 2 feet." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer dismissive, but charged. with a new, uncertain energy. They had expected a pilot. They had gotten something else entirely. Something they couldn't quite categorize, couldn't easily dismiss. The woman who called herself Valkyrie was an enigma, a puzzle they couldn't solve. And as they prepared for the mission, a seed of doubt began to sprout in their minds. Not about the mission's chances of success, but about the woman who was their only lifeline, their only hope of seeing another sunrise. The sky was waiting, and so was the serpent's tooth. The A-10 sat on the tarmac like a prehistoric beast, a creature of brute force and raw power. It was ugly, brutally functional, and utterly devoid of the sleek aerodynamic grace of modern fighter jets. Its twin engines were mounted high on the fuselage, its straight wings were thick and broad, and its nose was dominated by the massive 7-barreled GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon capable of spitting out 3,900 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium shells per minute. The SEALs, accustomed to the cutting-edge technology of their own world, looked at the Warthog with a mixture of pity and disdain. It was a relic, a flying tank designed to kill Soviet armor on the plains of Europe, not to dance through a modern, sophisticated air defense network. "You're seriously going to fly that thing into the serpent's tooth?" one of the younger SEALs asked, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. Rostova was conducting her pre-flight check, her movements precise and economical. She ran a gloved hand along the fuselage, her touch almost reverent. "She's not pretty," she admitted, her voice muffled by the roar of a nearby C-17, "but she's a survivor." She patted the nose of the plane, just above the cannon, "and she's got a hell of a bite." The SEALs weren't convinced. They saw a slow, cumbersome target, a flying coffin waiting to be shot out of the sky. They saw a pilot whose confidence bordered on delusion. What they didn't see was the bond between the woman and her machine. They didn't see the countless hours Rostova had spent in the cockpit, the intimate knowledge she had of every rivet, every wire, every quirk of the aging aircraft. They didn't see the modifications that had been made to this particular Warthog, the custom avionics, the enhanced countermeasures, the reinforced airframe. This wasn't just any A-10, this was Valkyrie's chariot, a machine as unique and underestimated as its pilot. The mission plan was insane. Rostova would fly in low, hugging the canyon walls, using the terrain to mask her approach. She would have to fly at an altitude that was considered suicidal, a mere 50 feet off the deck, a breath away from the jagged rocks and the churning river below. She would have to navigate the twisting, turning canyon at high speed, relying on instinct and muscle memory as much as her instruments. It was a feat of aviation that had never been attempted, a maneuver that defied the laws of physics and the limits of human endurance. The SEALs, for all their bravado, were starting to feel a prickle of unease. They were about to entrust their lives to a woman and a machine that seemed to belong to a bygone era. They were about to step into the abyss, with only the wings of a Valkyrie to carry them through the darkness. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the airfield. The sky, a canvas of fiery orange and deep purple, seemed to be holding its breath. The serpent's tooth was waiting. The final briefing was a study in contrasts. On one side of the table, the SEALs, a picture of quiet, coiled lethality. Their gear was laid out with meticulous precision, each piece of equipment a testament to their deadly craft. On the other side, Major Rostova, a solitary figure in her flight suit, a stark contrast to the heavily armed operators. The mission commander, a grizzled Navy captain with a face like a roadmap of past conflicts, laid out the final details. The insertion would be a high-altitude, low-pinning halo jump, a silent, ghostly descent into the heart of enemy territory. Once on the ground, the SEALs would move to their observation post, a rocky outcrop overlooking the compound. They would have a 12-hour window to identify and neutralize the target. If they were compromised, if the mission went loud, their only hope was Valkyrie. The captain turned to Rostova, his expression grim. "Major, I can't overstate the risks. You'll be flying into the most heavily defended airspace we've ever encountered. The odds are not in your favor." Rostova simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the satellite imagery of the valley. The serpent's tooth was a jagged scar on the landscape, a place of shadows and secrets. She traced the winding path of the canyon with her finger, her mind already flying the route, visualizing every turn, every potential threat. "I understand the risks, Captain," she said, her voice steady. The SEALs watched her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and doubt. They had seen her confidence, her quiet professionalism, but they still couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. They had lost count of the number of pilots who had bragged about their skills, only to freeze in the heat of combat. The sky was a fickle mistress. and the Serpent's Tooth was a place that devoured even the most experienced aviators. The team leader, the same bearded giant who had challenged her in the cantina, spoke up, his voice a low growl. "Major, with all due respect, we need to know what you can do. Not what you think you can do, but what you can guarantee." It was a direct challenge, a demand for proof. They needed to believe in her, to trust that she wouldn't be a liability when the bullets started flying. Rostova turned to face him, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. "I can't guarantee anything," she said, her honesty disarming. "No one can, but I can promise you this. When you call, I will be there. I will fly through the gates of hell to get to you, and I will not leave you behind." The words were spoken with a conviction that resonated through the room. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't arrogance, it was a solemn vow, a promise made by a warrior to her comrades in arms. The SEALs, for the first time, felt a flicker of something. Other than skepticism, they saw a fire in her eyes, a quiet determination that mirrored their own. The woman who called herself Valkyrie was not just a pilot, she was a warrior, and as they filed out of the briefing room, the weight of their doubts began to lift, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. The night was falling, and the Serpent's Tooth was waiting to claim its next victims, but this time, they would not be alone. The Valkyrie was coming. The C-17 ascended into the inky blackness, a behemoth of metal and machinery climbing towards the heavens. Inside, the SEALs sat in silence, the red glow of the cabin lights casting their faces in an eerie, demonic light. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and nervous sweat. They were a study in controlled tension, their bodies relaxed but their minds sharp, every sense attuned to the coming storm. They had done this 100 times before, this leap into the unknown, but this time felt different. The Serpent's Tooth was a different kind of beast, a place that seemed to exude a palpable sense of malevolence, and their only lifeline was a woman in an aging, ugly airplane, a woman with a mythical call sign and a quiet, unnerving confidence. The team leader, a man known only by his call sign, Ares, looked at his men. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the flicker of fear that they tried so hard to conceal. He knew what they were thinking. They were the best of the best, the tip of the spear, and they were being asked to put their faith in an unknown quantity. He keyed his comms, his voice, a low, reassuring rumble. "Check your gear, stay focused. We do what we do best." The men responded with a series of clicks, a silent affirmation of their training, their discipline, their brotherhood. They were a unit, a single cohesive entity, and they would face whatever the night threw at them, together. Miles away, in the cockpit of her A-10, Major Rostova was a world away from the tense silence of the C-17. She was in her element, a creature of the sky, her body and mind in perfect sync with her machine. The cockpit was a cocoon of familiar sights and sounds. The soft glow of the instruments, the gentle hum of the engines, the crackle of the radio. She was flying in complete radio silence, a ghost in the night, her warthog a shadow against the stardusted canvas of the sky. She had been flying for hours, a long circuitous route that had taken her far to the south, a feint designed to deceive any prying eyes. Now she was turning back, heading towards the Serpent's Tooth, a lone warrior, on a quest to defy the gods of war. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her hands moving with an almost unconscious grace over the controls. She was a master of her craft, a virtuoso of the sky, and her A-10 was her instrument. The first hint of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky, a faint, ethereal glow that heralded the coming of a new day. For the SEALs, it was a reminder of their own mortality, a countdown to the moment of truth. For Rostova, it was a signal, a call to action. The night was ending, and the hunt was about to begin. The Serpent's Tooth was waiting, and the Valkyrie was on her way. The sky was about to witness a dance of death, a ballet of courage and skill, that would be etched into the annals of military history. The jump was a whisper in the wind. One by one, the SEALs slipped out of the C-17, their dark forms swallowed by the pre-dawn gloom. They were phantoms, falling through the sky with a silent, deadly grace. The world was a blur of rushing air and the thumping of their own hearts. Then, the jolt of the parachutes opening, the sudden, jarring transition from freefall to a slow, controlled descent. The Serpent's Tooth rose up to meet them, a jagged moor of rock and shadow. The valley was even more imposing from this vantage point, a place of primal, untamed beauty. The canyon walls were sheer, almost vertical, and the river below was a silver ribbon of moonlight. The air was thin and cold, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through Their canopies, they landed with the soft thud of trained professionals, their movements economical and precise. They were ghosts in the darkness, their black gear blending seamlessly with the shadows. Within minutes they had gathered their equipment, buried their parachutes, and melted into the landscape. They were a team, a well-oiled machine, each man knowing his role, his purpose. They moved with a stealth that was almost supernatural, their feet making no sound on the rocky ground. They were hunters in their natural element, their senses on high alert, their minds focused on the mission. Their observation post was a rocky outcrop, a natural fortress that offered a commanding view of the compound below. The compound was a hive of activity, a collection of low-slung buildings surrounded by a high wall. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes stark against the flickering lights. It was a formidable target, a hornet's nest that was about to be kicked. Ares, the team leader, set up his spotting scope, his eyes scanning the compound. With a cold, analytical gaze, he was looking for the target, a man whose face he had memorized from a dozen satellite photos. He was a ghost, a man who had eluded capture for years, a man who was about to meet his end. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. The sun began to climb, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. The heat became oppressive, the air thick and still. The SEALs remained motionless, their discipline absolute. They were statues of patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then, it happened, a flicker of movement in a window, a face, pale and bearded, a face that matched the photos. Ares keyed his comms, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Target acquired. I have positive ID. The words were a spark in the tinderbox, a signal that the time for waiting was over. The time for action had come. The serpent's tooth was about to earn its name, and the Valkyrie, circling high above, a silent, unseen guardian, was about to be called to the dance. The first shot was a thunderclap in the stillness of the valley. It was a single, precise round from a suppressed sniper rifle, a whisper of death that echoed through the canyon. The guard on the east wall crumpled without a sound, a puppet with its strings cut. The hornet's nest had been kicked. The compound erupted in a frenzy of chaotic activity. Alarms blared, their shrill, insistent wail tearing through the morning air. Doors burst open, and armed men poured into the courtyard, their shouts a cacophony of confusion and rage. The SEALs, from their perch on the rocky outcrop, watched the chaos unfold with a cold, professional detachment. They were the masters of controlled violence, the orchestrators of this deadly symphony. They opened fire, their weapons spitting. A storm of lead and fury. The enemy, caught in the open, was cut down in a brutal, efficient slaughter. But the enemy was not a ragtag militia. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and they recovered quickly. They took cover, returned fire, and the valley became a cauldron of noise and violence. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and fear. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, their high-pitched whine a constant, unnerving reminder of the thin line between life and death. The SEALs were in their element, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. The compound was a fortress, and they were exposed, vulnerable. Ares, the team leader, knew they were running out of time. They had achieved their primary objective, the elimination of the high-value target, but now they had to get out, and the odds were stacking against them. He keyed his comms, his voice tight with urgency. Valkyrie, this is Ares. We are compromised. I repeat, we are compromised. We need immediate air support. The call was a desperate plea, a Hail Mary in the face of overwhelming odds. They had no idea if Rostova could hear them, if she could even get to them. The serpent's tooth was a death trap and they were trapped in its jaws. Miles away, in the cockpit of her A-10, Rostova heard the call. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady, her mind clear. This was the moment she had been training for, the moment she had been waiting for. She pushed the throttle forward, and the warthog, the ugly, lumbering beast, responded with a guttural roar. She was a Valkyrie, a warrior of the sky, and she was coming for her fallen comrades. She dove towards the serpent's tooth, a streak of gray against a brilliant blue of the sky. The canyon walls rose up to meet her, a jagged, unforgiving maw. The missile alerts began to scream, a symphony of electronic death. She was flying into the gates of hell, but she was not afraid. She was a hunter, and the serpent's tooth was her hunting ground. The SEALs pinned down, their ammunition running, low heard a new sound in the sky. It was a sound they had never heard before, a sound that was both terrifying and beautiful. It was the sound of a warthog at full throttle, the sound of a Valkyrie coming to the rescue. Hope, a fragile, flickering flame, was rekindled in their hearts. The A-10 screamed into the canyon, a vengeful angel of death. Rostova was flying at an altitude that was not just dangerous, it was insane. The tips of her wings were mere feet from the jagged canyon walls, the river below, a churning whitewater blur. The world was a maelstrom of rock and sky, a high-stakes ballet that demanded a level of skill and courage that bordered on the supernatural. The missile alerts were a constant, shrieking chorus in her ears. She was a target, a lone, defiant bird, in a sky filled with predators. But she was not a helpless prey. She was a hunter, and her warthog was her weapon. She jinked and weaved, her movements a blur of controlled chaos. She deployed flares, brilliant bursts of light that bloomed in the sky like fiery flowers, decoys to lure the heat-seeking missiles away from her engines. She was a dancer in a deadly pas de deux, her partner a series of streaking, explosive projectiles. The SEALs, from their precarious position on the rocky outcrop, watched in stunned disbelief. They had seen skilled pilots before, but this was something else entirely. This was a masterclass in aerial combat, a display of raw, unadulterated courage that left them breathless. The woman who called herself Valkyrie was not just flying her plane, she was a part of it, an extension of the machine, her will and its power fused into a single, unstoppable force. She was a whisper away from oblivion, a heartbeat away from becoming a fiery smear on the canyon wall. But she flew with a grace and precision that defied belief. She was a ghost in the machine, a phantom of the sky, and she was turning the tide of the battle. She made her first pass, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon erupting in a deafening, earth-shattering roar. The sound was a physical thing, a wave of pure, unadulterated power that shook the very foundations of the valley. A stream of 30mm depleted uranium shells, glowing like angry hornets, tore into the enemy positions, shredding men and machines with equal, indiscriminate fury. The effect was devastating. The enemy, who had been pressing their attack with a confident, arrogant swagger, were now in a state of panic and disarray. They had never seen anything like this, had never faced a weapon of such brutal, overwhelming power. They had been prepared for a fight, but they were not prepared for a warthog. They were not prepared for the Valkyrie. Rostova pulled up her A-10 climbing with a surprising agility, and prepared for another run. The sky was still full of threats, but she was no longer just a target. She was a predator, and the hunt had just begun. The serpent's tooth had bared its fangs, but the Valkyrie had answered with a roar of her own. The second pass was a symphony of destruction. Rostova, her eyes narrowed in concentration, her hands a blur of motion on the controls, unleashed the full fury of her warthog. She was no longer just a pilot, she was an artist, and the canyon was her canvas. She painted with fire and steel, her brushstrokes a series of devastating, precision strikes. She launched a maverick missile, a fire-and-forget weapon that streaked towards a fortified machine gun nest, a plume of white smoke trailing in its wake. The missile struck with a thunderous explosion, sending a shower of rock and shrapnel into the air. The machine gun, which had been spitting a deadly stream of lead at the pinned-down SEALs, was silenced forever. She then rolled her A-10 onto its side, a maneuver that would have been suicidal for any other aircraft, and unleashed a volley of rockets. The rockets, a swarm of angry, buzzing hornets, slammed into a group of enemy fighters who were trying to flank the SEALs' position. The result was a scene of pure, unadulterated carnage. The SEALs, who had been on the verge of being overrun, now had a chance. They had a lifeline, a guardian angel in a battered, ugly airplane. They watched in awe as Rostova danced through the sky, a blur of motion and courage. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of destruction, and she was on their side. The enemy, who had been so confident just moments before, were now in a state of shock and terror. They had never encountered a pilot like this, a warrior who seemed to be a part of the sky itself. They had heard whispers of the Valkyrie, but they had dismissed them as myths, as propaganda. Now they were facing the reality, and it was a reality that was far more terrifying than any legend. They began to retreat, to fall back, their will to fight broken by the sheer, overwhelming power of the A-10 and the skill of its pilot. They were no longer hunters, they were the hunted. Ares, the SEAL team leader, keyed his comms, his voice filled with a new, unfamiliar emotion. Valkyrie, you are a thing of beauty. I've never seen anything like it. Rostova's voice, when it came back, was calm, almost serene. Just doing my job, Ares. Now, let's get you out of there. The battle was not over. The serpent's tooth still held them in its grip. But the tide had turned, the balance of power had shifted. The SEALs who had been facing certain death now had a fighting chance. They had a Valkyrie on their side, and she was not about to let them fall. The sky, which had been their enemy, was now their salvation, and the woman who ruled it was a legend in the making. The exfiltration was a controlled, chaotic ballet. With the enemy in disarray, the SEALs began to move, their movements a blur of disciplined speed. They were no longer pinned down, no longer on the defensive, they were on the attack, moving with a renewed sense of purpose, a new fire in their bellies. They leapfrogged from cover to cover, their weapons spitting a steady, accurate stream of fire. They were a pack of wolves, a cohesive, deadly unit, and they were cutting a swath of destruction through the remaining enemy forces. Above them, Rostova was their overwatch, their guardian angel. She circled the valley like a hawk, her eyes scanning for any new threats, her warthog a constant, menacing presence in the sky. She was a shepherd, and the SEALs were her flock. She guided them with a series of low strafing runs, her cannon a fiery scythe that cleared a path for their escape. The enemy, what was left of them, was in a state of complete and utter panic. They were being attacked from the ground, and the air caught in a deadly crossfire from which there was no escape. They had been the masters of this valley, the kings of this castle, but now their kingdom was crumbling around them. They had underestimated the will of the SEALs, and they had underestimated the power of the Valkyrie. The rendezvous point was a small, dusty clearing at the mouth of the canyon. It was a place of relative safety, a place where a helicopter could land, a place where they could finally escape the clutches of the serpent's tooth. But getting there was still a challenge. The canyon was a maze of twists and turns, a natural fortress that was still a formidable obstacle. Rostova, with a skill that bordered on the miraculous, guided them through the labyrinth. She flew ahead of them, her a silver streak against the blue sky, her voice a calm, reassuring presence in their ears. Left at the next fork, she would say, her voice cutting through the cacophony of battle. Enemy patrol on the ridge. To your right, I'll take care of them. And she would, with a burst of cannon fire, a flash of rockets, a whisper of death from the sky. The SEALs, who had started the day with a healthy dose of skepticism, were now true believers. They had witnessed the impossible, had seen a pilot who could make an ugly, aging airplane dance on the head of a pin. They had seen a woman who could fly through the gates of hell and come out unscathed. They had seen a Valkyrie in action, and it was a sight they would never forget. They reached the clearing, their bodies bruised and battered, their ammunition nearly spent, but their spirits soaring. They had done it, they had walked into the lion's den and had come out alive. And they had done it because of the woman in the sky, the woman who had refused to leave them behind. The sound of an approaching helicopter, a welcome, rhythmic thumping, filled the air. Their ride home was here. But the story of the Valkyrie was far from over. The debriefing was a surreal experience. The same room, the same fluorescent lights, the same grizzled Navy captain, but the atmosphere was different. The air, which had been thick with tension and doubt, was now charged with a new, electric energy. The SEALs, who had been so stoic and reserved, were now animated, their voices filled with a mixture of excitement and awe. They were telling a story that was almost too incredible to be true. They spoke of a pilot who had flown at an altitude that should have been impossible, who had danced with death in a canyon of rock and fire. They spoke of a warthog that had become a vengeful angel, a machine of pure, unadulterated destruction. They spoke of a woman who had single-handedly turned the tide of a battle that had been all but lost. The captain listened, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. He had seen the gun camera footage, the raw, unedited video, that had captured every heart-stopping moment of Rostova's flight. He had seen the missile alerts, the near misses, the impossible maneuvers. He had seen a pilot who had not just bent the rules of aerial combat, but had shattered them into a million pieces. When the SEALs had finished their story, the room fell. Silent, the captain turned to Rostova, who had been standing quietly in the corner, her expression unreadable. "Major," he said, his voice filled with a respect that had been absent before. "You have rewritten the book on close air support. You have done something that no one thought was possible." Rostova simply nodded, her pale blue eyes betraying no emotion. "I was just doing my job, sir." The captain shook his head. "No, Major, you did more than your job. You gave those men a second chance. You brought them home." The words hung in the air, a testament to her courage, her skill, her unwavering commitment to her comrades in arms. She was a hero, a legend, in the making, but she didn't see it that way. She was a pilot, a warrior, and she had done what she had been trained to do. She had answered the call, had flown into the heart of the storm, and had brought her people back from the brink. The story of the Valkyrie began to spread, a whisper that grew into a roar. It was a story told in hushed tones in the cantinas and briefing rooms of forward operating bases around the world. It was a story of a woman who had defied the odds, who had flown where no one else dared to fly. It was a story that would inspire a new generation of pilots, a story that would become a part of the rich, storied history of the United States Air Force. But for Rostova, the story was not about fame or glory. It was about the bond between a pilot and her machine, between a warrior and her comrades. It was about the sky, her sanctuary, her battlefield, her home. And it was about a promise she had made to herself long ago, a promise she would carry with her on every flight, on every mission, until the day she finally hung up her wings. The call sign, Valkyrie, was not a random choice, not a flight of fancy. It was a legacy, a burden, a promise. It had belonged to her father, a legendary F-4 Phantom pilot who had been shot down over the jungles of Vietnam. He had been a ghost, a whisper in the wind, his fate unknown for decades. Kaylin had grown up in the shadow of his memory, a ghost of a ghost. She had spent her childhood poring over his letters, his flight logs, his faded photographs. She had learned to fly in the same skies he had once ruled, her heart filled with a burning desire to honor his memory, to finish the story he had never had the chance to write. She had earned her wings, had proven herself to be a pilot of exceptional skill and courage, but she had always felt like an outsider, a woman in a man's world, a daughter trying to live up to the legend of her father. When she had been assigned to the A-10, the Warthog, she had been met with skepticism and derision. It was an ugly, unglamorous aircraft, a relic of a bygone era. But Kaylin had seen something else. She had seen a survivor, a machine that was as underestimated and as resilient as she was. She had made it her own, had pushed it to its limits, had discovered a grace and power in its brutish form. She had taken her father's call sign, Valkyrie, as her own. It was a way of keeping him with her, of carrying his spirit into the sky. It was a promise, to him, a promise that she would always fly with courage, with honor, with a fierce determination to bring her comrades home. The mission into the Serpent's Tooth had been a crucible, a trial by fire. It had tested her skills, her courage, her very soul. She had flown into the heart of darkness, had faced her own mortality, and had emerged victorious. She had not just saved the lives of the SEALs. She had saved a part of herself. She had finally stepped out of her father's shadow, had forged her own legend. The SEALs, who had once mocked her call sign, now understood its meaning. They had seen the Valkyrie in action, had witnessed her fury and her grace. They had seen a warrior who had carried them back from the brink of death, who had given them a second chance at life. They had become a part of her story, a part of her legacy, and she had become a part of theirs. The bond between the pilot and the operators was no longer one of professional respect. It was one of deep, abiding friendship, a brotherhood and sisterhood forged in the crucible of combat. They were a team, a family, and they would forever be bound by the memory of the day the Valkyrie flew into the Serpent's Tooth. The aftermath of the mission was a whirlwind of reports, debriefs, and accolades. The story of the Serpent's Tooth became a case study at the Air Force Academy, a textbook example of unconventional warfare and inter-service cooperation. The gun camera footage was analyzed, dissected, and marveled at by a generation of young pilots who dreamed of one day flying with the same courage and skill as the legendary Valkyrie. Rostova, however, remained unchanged by the sudden glare of the spotlight. She was still the same quiet, self-contained woman, more comfortable in the cockpit of her A-10 than in a room full of admiring brass. She deflected the praise, shunned the interviews, and found solace in the familiar routines of a pilot's life. She was a creature of the sky, and the ground was a foreign, uncomfortable place. The SEALs, on the other hand, were not so reticent. They became her biggest advocates, her most vocal champions. They told her story to anyone who would listen, their voices filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. They had seen the face of God in the sky, and it was the face of a woman in a warthog. Ares, the team leader, became a frequent visitor to the airfield where Rostova was stationed. He would sit with her in the shade of her A-10, the two of them sharing a quiet, comfortable silence. They were an unlikely pair, the grizzled, battle-hardened operator and the ethereal, almost otherworldly pilot. But they shared a bond that transcended words, a connection forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. "You know," Ares said one day, his voice a low rumble, "we had a name for you before the mission." Rostova raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Oh yeah," he said, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. "We called you the Ice Queen. We thought you were cold, aloof, arrogant. Rostova laughed, a rare musical sound that seemed to surprise even herself. And now, she asked. Ares looked at her, his eyes filled with a warmth and admiration that was a far cry from the cold, dismissive gaze he had once given her. Now, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, we call you family. The word hung in the air, simple, powerful testament to the transformation that had taken place. The woman who had once been an outsider, an enigma, was now a part of their tribe, a sister in arms. The Ice Queen had melted, and in her place stood a Valkyrie, a warrior, a friend. The sky was her kingdom, but she had found a home on the ground, a family that she would cherish for the rest of her days. The legend of the Valkyrie grew with each telling, each new mission, each impossible feat of aviation. She became a symbol of hope, a beacon of courage, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the American warrior. But for Rostova, the legend was a heavy mantle to bear. She was not a mythical creature, not a supernatural being. She was a woman, a pilot, a daughter who was still trying to make peace with the ghost of her father. She found solace in the sky, in the solitude of the cockpit, in the familiar embrace of her A-10. It was the only place where she could be herself, the only place where the weight of the legend seemed to lift. She flew with a fierce, almost reckless abandon, pushing her warthog to its limits, testing the boundaries of what was possible. She was a poet of the sky, her movements a symphony of grace and power. But there was a sadness in her eyes, a quiet, unspoken grief that even the thrill of flight could not erase. Ares saw it, of course. He had seen that same look in the eyes of too many soldiers, the haunted, faraway gaze of those who had seen too much, lost too much. He knew that Rostova was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with missiles or machine guns, a battle that was being waged in the quiet, desolate landscape of her own heart. He tried to reach her, to break through the wall of silence she had built around herself. He would talk to her for hours, sharing stories of his own struggles, his own demons. He was a warrior, and he knew that the deepest wounds were the ones that could not be seen. Rostova listened, her expression unreadable, but he could see the flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. She was a Valkyrie, a warrior of the sky, but she was also a woman who was carrying a heavy burden, a woman who was desperately in need of a friend. One day, as they were sitting in the shade of her A-10, Ares gave her a small, tarnished silver locket. It was my mother's, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She gave it to me before my first deployment. She told me it would keep me safe. Rostova opened the locket. Inside, there was a tiny faded photograph of a young woman with a bright, hopeful smile. She's beautiful, Rostova whispered. She was, Ares said, his voice cracking. She was the strongest person I ever knew. Rostova closed the locket, her fingers tracing the intricate design on its surface. She didn't say anything, but Ares could see the tears welling up in her eyes. It was the first time he had ever seen her cry. It was a small crack in the armor, a tiny chink in the wall of her self-control, but it was a start. The Valkyrie was still a warrior, but she was also learning to be human again. The call came in the dead of night, a frantic, desperate plea for help. A special forces team was pinned down in a remote mountain pass, surrounded by a new, superior enemy force. They were out of ammunition, out of time, out of hope. It was a suicide mission, a lost cause. But there was one pilot who was willing to fly into the jaws of death, one pilot who had made a career out of defying the odds. The Valkyrie was called to the dance once more. The weather was atrocious, a swirling maelstrom of snow and wind. The mountains were treacherous, their peaks hidden by a thick, impenetrable blanket of clouds. It was a flight that no sane pilot would attempt. But Rostova was not sane, not in the conventional sense. She was a creature of the sky, and the storm was just another challenge to be overcome. She flew her A-10 into the heart of the blizzard, a ghost in a world of white. She was flying blind, relying on her instruments, her instincts, her intimate knowledge of her machine. The wind buffeted her warthog, tossing it about like a child's toy. But she held it steady, her hands a blur of motion on the controls, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. She was a surgeon, and the storm was her operating theater. She found the pass, a narrow, treacherous gap in the mountains, and descended into the chaos below. The battle was a maelstrom of fire and fury, a desperate last-ditch stand against overwhelming odds. The Special Forces team was huddled behind a rocky outcrop, their faces grim, their weapons silent. They were preparing for the end. Then they heard it, a sound that was both terrifying and beautiful, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm and the cacophony of battle. It was the sound of a warthog, the sound of the Valkyrie. Hope, a fragile, flickering flame, was rekindled in their hearts. Rostova made her first pass, a low screaming run that sent a shiver of fear through the enemy ranks. She unleashed her cannon, a torrent of fire and steel that tore a bloody swath through the enemy lines. The effect was devastating. The enemy, who had been on the verge of victory, were now in a state of shock and disarray. They had been prepared for a fight, but they were not prepared for a warthog. They were not prepared for the Valkyrie. She made another pass, and another, her warthog, a relentless, unstoppable force of destruction. She was a whirlwind of fire and fury, a vengeful angel of death. She was the Valkyrie, and she had come to carry her fallen comrades home. The storm raged, but the tide of the battle had turned. The Special Forces team, their spirits renewed, their courage rekindled, joined the fight. They were no longer a band of desperate, cornered men. They were warriors, and they were fighting alongside a legend. The battle for the mountain pass was a brutal, drawn-out affair. For hours Rostova circled the battlefield, a tireless, vigilant guardian. She was a master of her craft, her A-10, a seamless extension of her will. She anticipated the enemy's moves, countered their attacks, and created openings for the Special Forces team to exploit. She was a chess master, and the battlefield was her board. The enemy, a hardened, experienced fighting force, had never encountered anything like her. They had fought against jets, against helicopters, against drones, but they had never fought against a warthog flown by a pilot who seemed to be a part of the storm itself. They threw everything they had at her, a barrage of anti-aircraft fire, a storm of surface-to-air missiles, but she was a ghost, a phantom, a whisper in the wind. She danced through their defenses, her movements a blur of grace and precision. She was untouchable, a mythical creature who seemed to be immune to their weapons. The Special Forces team, emboldened by her presence, fought with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. They were no longer just trying to survive, they were trying to win. They were inspired by her courage, by her unwavering commitment to their survival. They were a part of her legend, and they were determined to live up to it. As the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, the enemy's will finally broke. They had been battered, bloodied, and demoralized. They had lost too many men, too many machines. They had been defeated not by a superior force, but by a single pilot, a single airplane, a single, indomitable will. They began to retreat, their flight a chaotic, desperate scramble for survival. The battle was over. The mountain pass was secure. The Special Forces team was safe. Rostova, her fuel tanks running on fumes, her ammunition depleted, finally turned her warthog for home. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind numb, but she was also filled with a sense of quiet satisfaction, a sense of pride in a job well done. She had faced the storm, had stared into the abyss, and had emerged victorious. She had once again proven that the Valkyrie was not just a legend, but a living, breathing reality. The sky, which had been a place of terror and death, was now a place of salvation and hope. And the woman who ruled it was a hero, a guardian, a sister in arms. The story of the Valkyrie had a new chapter, a new testament to her courage, her skill, her unwavering devotion to her comrades, and the legend continued to grow. The return to base was a quiet, almost somber affair. The Special Forces team, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude, greeted Rostova with a reverence that was almost religious. They didn't say much, but their eyes spoke volumes. They had been to the brink of death, and she had pulled them back. She was their savior, their guardian angel, their Valkyrie. Rostova, however, was in no mood for celebration. The adrenaline had worn off, and she was left with a bone-deep weariness, a sense of emptiness that was all too familiar. She had done her job, had saved lives, but the cost was always high. The images of the battle, the faces of the men she had killed, were seared into her memory, a constant, haunting reminder of the brutal reality of war. She found Ares waiting for her by her A-10, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He didn't say anything, just handed her the mug and stood with her in the cold, morning air. They watched as the ground crew swarmed over her warthog, their movements a blur of efficient, practiced motion. The plane was a mess, its fuselage pockmarked with shrapnel, its wings scarred by misses. It was a testament to the ferocity of the battle, a symbol of their shared survival. "You know," Ares said finally, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "you don't have to carry it all yourself." Rostova looked at him, her pale blue eyes filled with a pain that she could no longer conceal. "It's my job," she whispered. "It's my burden." "No," Ares said, his voice firm. "It's our burden. We're a team, remember? A family." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. It was a simple gesture, a small act of human connection, but it was enough to break through the wall of her reserve. The tears came then, silent, streaming down her face, a release of all the pain, all the fear, all the grief she had been holding inside. Ares held her, his strong arms a comforting embrace, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. The Valkyrie was a warrior, a legend, a hero, but she was also a woman, a daughter, a friend, and she was finally learning that it was okay to be all of those things at once. The sky was her kingdom, but she had found a sanctuary on the ground, a place where she could be vulnerable, a place where she could heal. The legend of the Valkyrie was not just about courage and skill, it was about resilience, about friendship, about the enduring power of the human spirit. And it was a legend that was still being written. The years passed, and the legend of the Valkyrie became a part of the fabric of military folklore. She was a ghost story told to new recruits, a cautionary tale for cocky young pilots, a symbol of hope for those who found themselves in impossible situations. She was the pilot who could fly through hell and come out singing, the woman who could make a warthog dance, the warrior who would never leave a comrade behind. Rostova, however, never embraced the legend. She remained the same quiet, unassuming woman, her life a testament to the simple virtues of duty, honor, and courage. She continued to fly, to serve, to answer the call whenever it came. She was a pilot, and that was all she ever wanted to be. She and Ares remained close, their friendship, a constant, steady presence in a world of chaos and uncertainty. There were two sides of the same coin, the warrior of the sky and the warrior of the ground, their lives forever intertwined by the events of the Serpent's Tooth. They were a family, a tribe of two, and they found strength and solace in their shared experiences, their unspoken understanding. One day, years after the mission that had made her a legend, Rostova received a package in the mail. It was a small wooden box, its surface smooth and worn with age. Inside there was a single, tarnished silver star, the kind that was awarded for valor in combat. There was no note, no explanation, just the star and a faded black and white photograph of a young man in a flight suit, his smile bright and full of hope. It was her father. The star was his, a medal he had been awarded posthumously, a medal that had been lost to time and bureaucracy. It had been found by a veterans group, a group that had dedicated itself to finding and returning lost medals to the families of fallen soldiers. Rostova held the star in her hand, its weight a tangible connection to the father she had never known. The tears came then, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude, of closure, of peace. The ghost that had haunted her for so long was finally at rest. She had honored his memory, had carried his legacy, had finished his story. She was no longer just the daughter of a hero. She was a hero in her own right. She was the Valkyrie, and she had finally found her way home. The sky was still her kingdom, but her heart was no longer a battlefield. It was a place of peace, a place of love, a place where the memory of her father and the friendship of her comrades would live on forever. Major Kalen Valkyrie Rostova's final flight was not in a combat zone, not in a storm-tossed sky, not in a hail of enemy fire. It was on a clear, crisp autumn day, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. She was flying her A-10, her beloved Warthog, one last time, a farewell tour of the skies she had called home for so many years. She flew over the mountains, the deserts, the sprawling cities of her homeland. She flew over the places where she had trained, where she had fought, where she had almost died. She flew over the places that had shaped her, that had made her the woman, the pilot, the legend she had become. Ares was with her, not in the cockpit, but on the ground, his voice a familiar, reassuring presence in her ear. He was her ground, control, her anchor, her friend. He was with her every step of the way, just as he had been from the very beginning. As she made her final approach to the airfield, she saw them, a crowd of people, hundreds of them, lining the runway. They were soldiers, airmen, sailors, marines. They were the men and women she had served with, the people she had fought for, the comrades she had saved. They were her family, and they had come to say goodbye. She landed her warthog with a gentle, graceful touch, a final, loving caress of the machine that had been her partner, her protector, her friend. She shut down the engines, the sudden silence, a deafening roar in the cockpit. She took a deep breath, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. It was over. The Valkyrie had come home to roost. She climbed out of the cockpit, her movements slow, deliberate. The crowd erupted in a thunderous ovation, a wave of love and respect that washed over her. that filled her with a warmth that chased away the chill of the autumn air. She saw Ares, his face beaming with pride, his eyes shining with unshed tears. She saw the SEALs, the Special Forces team, the countless others whose lives she had touched, whose lives she had saved. They were all there, a living testament to her courage, her skill, her unwavering commitment to her comrades. She was not a legend, not a myth, not a ghost. She was a woman, a pilot, a friend, and she was loved. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the airfield. The sky, her kingdom, was ablaze with the fiery colors of a new dawn. The Valkyrie's flight was over, but her story, her legacy, would live on forever. A beacon of hope, a symbol of courage, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, tail number 810964, the Valkyrie was retired from service. Its battered, scarred fuselage, a testament to a long and storied career. It was not sent to the boneyard, the graveyard of forgotten warbirds. It was given a place of honor, a permanent home in the National Museum of the United States Air Force. It sat in the main gallery, a silent, hulking beast, a relic of a bygone era. But it was more than just a machine of war. It was a symbol, a legend, a story. It was the story of a pilot who had defied the odds, who had flown where no one else dared to fly. It was the story of a woman who had shattered the stereotypes, who had proven that courage and skill know no gender. It was the story of a bond between a pilot and her machine, between a warrior and her comrades. Visitors would stand before the Warthog, their eyes wide with awe, their voices hushed with reverence. They would read the plaque, the simple, understated account of its most famous mission, the flight into the Serpent's Tooth. They would look at the photograph of the pilot, a woman with pale blue eyes and a quiet, determined smile. They would hear the whispers of the legend, the stories of the Valkyrie, the warrior of the sky. Kaylin Rostova, the woman behind the legend, lived a long and happy life. She never flew again, but she never left the sky. She became a mentor, a teacher, an inspiration to a new generation of pilots. She shared her knowledge, her experience, her wisdom, but she never talked about the legend. She talked about the importance of teamwork, of courage, of never leaving a comrade behind. She and Ares remained inseparable, their friendship a beacon of light in a world that was often dark and uncertain. They grew old together, their lives a testament to the enduring power of love and loyalty. They were a family, and they were at peace. The legend of the Valkyrie was not about one woman, one pilot, one mission. It was about the spirit of the American warrior, the spirit of self-sacrifice, of courage, of unwavering commitment to a cause greater than oneself. It was a story that would be told and retold for generations to come, a story that would continue to inspire, to uplift, to remind us of the extraordinary things that ordinary people are capable of when they are called to a higher purpose. That Valkyrie was a legend, but she was also a legacy, a promise, a dream, and she would live on forever in the hearts and minds of those who dared to look to the sky and believe in the impossible.